Hey, this is Cedric Youngelman, your host of the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. Today's episode with Bob Burnett, the CEO of Barefoot Mining, who has become a good friend and mentor to me, was recorded several weeks ago, but I still think there is a tremendous amount of signal in here, as Bob always packs a punch. We talk about wars over hash rate, Bob's most famous patent, the future of block space, how countries could possibly be sovereign in a Bitcoin world. And towards the end of our conversation, we turn to some tough, hard topics like suicide, retirement, quality of life, and true happiness. On a side note, since this chat, Bob and I have kicked off a number of personal projects that I can't wait to tell you more about when the time comes for us to announce them to the world. In the meantime, please keep in mind that this podcast is a passion project that could use your support to keep going. If you enjoy my content, please consider sponsoring or donating. And if your company is interested in sponsoring the Bitcoin Matrix podcast, please reach out to me directly at cedric@thebitcoinmatrix.com, on Twitter at @CedYoungelman, and at _Bitcoin Matrix, or check out our new website at thebitcoinmatrix.com and sign up for my upcoming newsletter. Thank you to Jonathan Hawks over at Butter Creative for doing such a dope job on the new website. It looks awesome. Also, I want to take a moment to express my heartfelt gratitude to all of you for tuning in, supporting the show, and contributing. Your support means the world to me, and I never could have imagined this level of engagement when I started this journey 4 years ago. And I would love to continue doing this because I feel this is important information to share with you and the world. And now, let's enter the Bitcoin Matrix with Bob Burnett.
What is real? How do you define real?
You can't jump into cash. Cash is trash. What do? You get out.
Bob Burnett is the founder and CEO of Barefoot Mining, a company focused on the development of horse-class mining sites. And he is a vocal proponent for the expansion of diversity in Bitcoin mining site geography, scale, and energy sources. Bob has spent over 35 years as a technologist, including 13 years at Gateway Inc., a Fortune 200 personal computer company, where he led the company's product development efforts as chief technical officer. He has founded several companies in the Bitcoin mining space and is an evangelist and educator for Bitcoin and its importance to the world's future. He has a degree in computer engineering from the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. Bob, welcome back to the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. How are you?
I am great, Cedric. Good to see you always.
It's great to see you as always. I think the last time we got together in person, maybe at dinner, and then we've seen each other at conferences here and there. I think recently I saw you mention something in a tweet about some sort of M&A transaction that you were involved in. Had you ended up working in Skokie for a while, commuting to Skokie, I think, for a bit, which is the neck of the woods that I moved from before Florida.
Yes, Skokie, Illinois. The genesis of my entrepreneurial career was right there, actually. So I had been working out of college. I went to work for Zenith, which for the older members of the audience would remember as a big TV brand, the inventor of the remote control, actually. And they had a personal computer division right at the inception of the personal computer. And I went to work for that group. It's when I was on the early design teams of some of the world's first laptops and early, what were called at the time, clones. And I left there after kind of reaching some philosophical impasses with the management team at the time. And by the way, I say that I was 27 years old at the time, of course, at reaching philosophical impasses, but much like maybe some Bitcoiners do. And it was like, hey, I see the future of mobile computing and it's small, light, long battery lives. And the goal is not to make them real cheap. And their direction was, hey, if we could just make these, what I would call boat anchors, you would think of, at the time we were developing like laptops that we'd like 9, 10, 11, 12 pounds. And their direction was, well, if we could just make these cheaper. And so I saw that technology was changing such that, we could take this path, and a couple other guys in the company did too. So we presented our vision. They didn't like it. So we were able to, ironically, convince a couple Japanese companies to invest in us. And they did. One of them was a company called Mitsui, which those of you in the finance world might know, but massive, massive Japanese company. Roughly the same size as Bank of America, just to put it in perspective. They hold about the same amount of assets. And they invested in us, but part of the prerequisite was that Biska had to work in their offices for the first year. Now, they said that was to save money because I got free rent. It was really to make sure that I think they could see what we were doing, right? They could kind of look over our shoulders, and we knew that. But hey, they were at the time, it was about a $15 million investment. So hey, that's a lot of money in 1990,
Still a lot
by
of
the
money.
way. So
Yeah,
it's still a
big
lot of
raise
money,
now.
right?
Yeah.
So so that had me working in Skokie. Now I grew up just north of there, so that wasn't a huge stretch for me. I grew up in Kenosha, Wisconsin, which is just, I don't know what, 35, 40 miles north of Skokie. But ended up being a phenomenal experience, not just because they made this investment, but and that investment, the product we developed actually ended up getting purchased by Gateway, and it led to me having my job at Gateway. Which is a little side note. I mean, that's one thing is you never know what's going to happen. We created this company thinking we were going to be, a giant in mobile computing, and didn't actually turn out that way, but it ended up with me being part of Gateway, and we did become part of, personal computing history, and one of the giants of personal computer industry. Just didn't quite go the way that I thought. But what was also interesting was it opened my eyes to, on the first level, just the Japanese work style. Like they had a different way of organizing companies, their processes, the way they interacted with each other. All those sorts of things were very, very different. And ultimately what it led to was I think kind of interesting. As a kid growing up in the Midwest, I was kind of led to believe, I think that, I shouldn't say I think, I was led to believe that the American way of doing things, that we were smarter, that we worked harder, that we produced higher quality goods. And there were all of these kind of really dangerous, self-inflating things that we were teaching people. And then I started working with the Japanese. And then I ended up spending time in Japan and going to their factories and seeing their design techniques, going, wow, this fallacy that American made is always best, that we have the greatest ingenuity, that we have the greatest quality, that's bullshit, and it really opened my eyes, I think in a very positive way. But I realized how dangerous we are when we raise this. We have a culture, I think it was really prevalent in the 70s and 80s, that we're the best at everything. That's a really dangerous mentality. It creates a false sense of confidence, right? So, yeah. So
That probably
anyways,
starts with we think we're the best at government, which is a dangerous maybe idea. So, but one thing that stuck with me, both in your bio and the conversation, what you just laid out there, and the conversation we were having at dinner, was you called yourself a technologist. And, not many people, most people think of themselves as like a plumber, an accountant, maybe an entrepreneur. But how would you describe, what a technologist is? 'Cause I don't think we have enough of them right now, or maybe people aren't self-identifying because they don't know this definition.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it's somebody that straddles the world of science and engineering on one side and social structure and change on the other side. So it's like, hey, these things are, so I think another way to look at it is things are happening in the science and engineering worlds. And AI is probably the most prevalent thing, right now, like that's very in the forefront outside of the Bitcoin world, right? We have this AI thing sitting here. So what does it really mean to the world 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? You have to look deeper than just the technology. What you have to look at is you have to look at the way people live. What are their familial structures? What are their business styles? What are their styles of government? What cultural implications are there for these? And you definitely have to step out. If you want to be a technologist, you got to step out of just your Western mindset. I had some really interesting experiences kind of learning to do that. I think one, as a young boy, first of all, I was captivated by science fiction. And so I think the early technologists were people like Jules Verne. Jules Verne wrote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Around the World in 80 Days, like those kind of books. And if you think about what he was doing, was he was really he was a technologist, and he would put it into story form, his vision of the future, right? He was highly accurate, by the way. He was really, really good at it. Da Vinci did that. Isaac Asimov did that. Arthur C. Clarke did that. Like, these are some of the great thinkers. And Steve Jobs was pretty good at that. Elon Musk is pretty good at that. And I'm not saying I'm any of those people, but I'm trying to, and I have since I was very young, tried to think that way. Like, I've been doing, we maybe talk about it later. I've been doing this mental exercise because a friend of mine, we've been talking about the implications of free energy on society, and what would it mean in a world where there was free energy. I mean, it's a rabbit hole we could go down in a little bit, but to stay on this topic of what's a technologist, and then to be a technologist, you have to go step into different ways of living. And what I learned was, this was back in my gateway days, there was a point in time when technology was primarily being developed in the West, primarily in the United States. This would have been, let's say, in the 80s and into the early 90s. Technology was being developed in the US and adopted in the US first, personal computer being a great example of that. But I started to notice change. Now, by the time we got to the mid 90s, I was traveling extensively internationally. And I was starting to learn things like, hey, in other markets, even second and third world markets, there are times when very advanced technology is penetrating the culture or society faster than in the US, or in unusual ways. So I'll give you two examples. One was, I remember making a trip to Korea, late 90s. And late 90s, maybe 2000, somewhere right in that time period. What we were seeing was this massive explosion of gaming in South Korea. And sounds obvious right now, but at the time, we're in the early days of the Xbox and the PlayStation. People were gaming, but they weren't doing connected gaming. They were, you're probably old enough to remember this, Cedric. Like, you would put a game in, you just play yourself, right? You're gonna play soccer, you play the machine, you don't play some person on the other side of the world. You're doing that. You're trying to get the high score on Pac-Man or something like that.
Or maybe you play the guy next to you.
Yeah, right. You have your buddies over, and you have a gaming night. Well, Korea started to be different. And what was happening in Korea was, it was it was online gaming, the first market where online gaming exploded. And it exploded not just in usage, but it permeated the whole culture. So what was happening was the best gamers in the world, they played a lot of like first person shooter kind of games in that era, right? The best players were massive celebrities within the country. Like it wasn't a niche thing. And they became massive celebrities in part because it was so popular that they had dedicated TV shows. This is like pre-Twitch or anything like that. They just would have a TV show and they would broadcast the games and they would have an analyst and a play-by-play guy. And they were doing commentary on video games, the best players in Korea, the same way that you would have listened to somebody doing a basketball game or a football game here in the US. It was being done the same way. And then these people who were the best at it were making massive amounts of money. They're doing advertising. I became aware of this. So I went to Korea and I spent a little time there just to try to immerse myself. What's going on? What's the root of it? Well, the root of it really was, at the end of the day, two things, I think. One was that in Korea, people lived in these massive housing structures. So there weren't a lot of single family homes. What there were massive buildings with condos or apartments in them. And Korea, because they had this massive density of people, was able to bring fiber connectivity to these places. And so people were getting very high-speed broadband a decade ahead of the US or any other Western country. And that facilitated the ability for the gaming, from the technological standpoint. But that wasn't 100. I kind of knew that a little bit before but there was a second component to it, which is just the way that the culture is structured. So in these apartments, there's not a lot of privacy. So when you're in a typical Korean family like that, you might have, these condos might be 900 square feet, 2 or 3 tiny bedrooms, 1 living space, kind of a shared kitchen. Everybody's kind of cramped. There's no privacy. And what you realize is that the gamers, the people were paying massive amounts of games. It allowed them like a privacy, like, why do you want to do this? Well, the rest of the stuff can be going on in the apartment and it gives them their own little world. Like, they can distance themselves from the chaos of the rest of the house by being there. And also, they have a second thing they call them PC bang at the time. PC meaning the gaming for the personal computer, and the bang was like a BANG, bang or bang. And what they would do is they had these rooms that you could rent. So you could rent out a room for a night, kind of like when you rent a cabana at a pool. Okay, it's kind of like that. So you go to this place and they'll have several of these rooms. There's enough space in there for 5 or 6 people. And they'll have the fastest personal computer in the world, the very best internet connection. They'll serve drinks and food and that other stuff. And you go rent that for 4 hours or 5 hours for the night. And, it might be for people in their late teens or early 20s, they would go there and they would do that. So I went there. So again, we're kind of talking about a technologist. You have to go there and experience that. I don't know, why is this happening? Now, the other thing that always sticks out with me from that era was when I was at Gateway, we never got it to market, but we were working on what you would now call a smartphone. This was before the iPhone, and I was in the process of developing one. And we're trying to make this decision about really, are we going to be more like a BlackBerry, which was the most popular, sexiest phone at the time, right? And it was really geared around because it had email capability, right? So you could get your email on it, and it had a hard keyboard on
Corporate
it.
email.
Yeah, corporate email, you could do that real quickly. Versus like the Nokias, which were like you only had the 10 key pad, but people would get really good at like sending a text message,
Right.
being able to do that. Well, at the time in the United States, the average person was sending just a tiny bit over one text message per day. Well, it's probably hard to even fathom, right? Less than one text message per day. But I found this statistic, and the statistic was that in the Philippines, again, like year 2000, people were sending 22 text messages a day. Well, this is a radical difference, like radical difference, right?
Yeah.
22 times more text messages per day. And this is a country that is leading the world, yet, I mean, it's not the poorest of the poor, but it's not a wealthy country. Like, how the hell is this happening? Well, go there and immerse yourself in the culture and the way people are living. And what you realize is that what we now see in the US, right? They had leapfrogged us, and they realized that they didn't need to talk to people. That was the end of the day. Partly it was economics driven, but they also, for whatever reason inside their culture, they were very comfortable to just say, hey, meet me at the coffee shop, right? They could send a text message for that. It was cheaper and faster. And it turned out, I didn't realize this till later, like they had a pager market penetration that was like way above the US. So what they were doing was they were completely skipping using the mobile network for voice calls, and they were replacing the pager market. And they led the world in text messaging. So it helped me think about how I wanted to design this next generation mobile phone, because you could see that this was the primary usage model that was emerging, right?
Yeah.
Um, so so I think you're right, though, going back a little bit, I don't think I think people in our society have a very difficult time stepping back, spending time, and thinking 2, 3, 4, 10 years in advance. It's just, and you could probably say that true, whether they're thinking about technology, or they're thinking about their family, or they're thinking about their finances, or whatever. They just, do that. So that'll another way of saying we have a very high time preference society throughout the entire Western world. And I think it's getting worse. And the number of people willing to step back, take a breath, where, whether it's where do I want to go, and what do I want in my future, and how do I plan for that, or, you know, the technology is doing something, whether that, like, for instance, whether it's the emergence of Bitcoin or the emergence of AI, what does that mean? Like, and how do I capitalize on it, right? How do I capitalize on it? If I can see it before somebody else, then I can probably capitalize on it. And that's an interesting thing, because I have a lot of patents, and I've had people ask me before, like, how did you think of that? Or that's, brilliant, you thought of that. And I'll say, well, not really. I think that what really happened was I was the first person to ask the question. So when something new is happening, when something is evolving, if you say, like, here's the example. Like, I think my most famous patent, if you want to call it, has an interesting story to it. Same era, early 2000s. We had identified already, this is pre the iPod as well. We had identified the shift from CDs to MP3s. Okay, that transition was happening hard. We could see it. So, well, this is how people want to consume their audio. So we started developing a MP3 player, that was a US, this happens to be a ledger, but it was this for those watching, it was this size, the size of a USB stick. Well, the idea was that, hey, you could put, at that time, you could put a few hundred songs on there, right? You could create a playlist and you do that on you plug that thing in, kind of get it set up on your computer. And then this device at the time, it had 3 buttons on it. It had one button that would be play, pause, one button that would be advance to the next track, and one button that would be reverse to the previous track, right? So you probably can think of that. And then it had one headphone jack, pre-Bluetooth and all that. So we had got it in a prototype working, and I was using it. And what I had done was I had, do you remember the term ripping a CD?
Yeah.
So ripping a CD used to mean you'd take a CD and you would create the MP3 file for it yourself. Okay. Well, I had done that with an audiobook. So I had taken a CD that had an audiobook on it and I had ripped it. So it's just one big file. Okay.
Huge file.
So, excuse
like
me?
Huge audio file, like really long length of time.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. And not divided into chapters and something nice and elegant, just like one big file, right? I forgot I don't know, 8 hours or something like that, right? Just this massive file. Okay. So I'm out for a run. I was running a lot in those days, still run a little bit. And I have a pair of earbuds in, wired earbuds, and they're connected to this device, and I'm out running. And I'm one of the first people in the world, by the way, to have this experience, which is kind of neat, right? Because at the time, all people had were like the Discman or the Walkmans, right? So this was, I could already feel like, hey, this is going to be revolutionary because I don't have this big bulky thing with me. But anyway, I'm out there running and I'm listening to the book. It was a good book. It was getting to a really interesting, kind of thrilling part of the book. And my elbow caught the cord, at which point it ripped the earbuds out of my ear. It ripped the headphone out of the jack of the MP3 player. The MP3 player flew like, I don't know, 10 feet this way. The earbuds flew the other way. I got all discombobulated. Like shit, right? So I get the thing reassembled and I put it in my ears, which took a couple minutes, and the book had not stopped playing. And I was so frustrated because remember, my choices are reverse all the way to the beginning of the book, which I was already several hours in, or go to the next audio file, which would have been after the end of the book. I had no way to just reverse a short amount.
Right.
Okay. Which, that innovation of itself ended up being in the MP3 player. But here's the real problem, or the real thing. I realized that had I just stopped the audio track at the moment the headphone jack separated from the MP3 player, everything would have been fine. So I said, I can do that. That's a simple thing. I can electrically detect this change electrically and stop it. So, and vice versa, if I plug it back in, I can restart it. Okay. So that's my patent. And today, if you're like listening to your iPhone and somebody talks to you and you take an earbud out of your ear and it stops, that's my patent being implemented and putting it back in. So the reason that whole thing happened, though, was because I was the first person to see the problem, right? So solving the problem was fairly easy, but it was identifying the problem that was the hard part. And I had the benefit of being one of the first people in the world to use an MP3 player. So that allowed that invention to take place. And I think that kind of maybe exemplifies what it means to be a technologist to a certain degree. Like, you put yourself in these situations. Now, that was a real one. The other thing you can do is sit there and try to think about it. Like, you have to imagine it, much like Jules Verne did, right? You have to say, well, what, you know, uh, can I make a basically, can I make a submarine? And if I could make a submarine, then what would happen next? Those are,
Right.
yeah.
I laugh because it's great that I love this story because it shows the power of usage and thinking and keep going. Meaning, while you were solving that problem, I was in a parallel universe at the same exact time running with a Discman, because I wanted to run with music with a stupidly long cord, because you couldn't find the right length cord to accomplish this.
Yes.
And, my knee or elbow probably caught the cord. I probably went tripping and falling, scraped my knee. The Discman goes flying. You
Yeah.
have to then go track the Discman, man, make sure it's not broken, buttons didn't fall off. And then you got to go get the CD and make sure there wasn't scratches. And that was before, all you did that all before you put it in, and then had to go look for what track you were on. And you couldn't get to where you were in the track that you were on anyway. Even if it was music, you had to go to the beginning of the track, and it
Yep.
ruined the whole experience, and you looked like an idiot in front of everyone around you. So just having the MP3 player solved all of that, but you kept going and solved more problems. Now the cord comes loose, and we can do more with it than just prevent the fall because we just eliminated the Discman. You
Yeah.
kept solving problems and iterating. And that brings me to sort of where we are, where do you think we are with Bitcoin and technology adoption? I'd argue that very few people are using Bitcoin in the way that you're running around with the MP3 player and I'm running around with the Discman. I think, a small subset of, larger subset of users are probably just looking for price exposure,
Yeah.
whether it's through Bitcoin and an exchange, whether even if they take some self-custody or, ETFs. But like, where would you categorize us, or how would you describe where we are with technology adoption in Bitcoin?
Yeah, I like the way you phrase the question, because I think um, it's a different answer than where are we in Bitcoin adoption, right?
Right.
So Bitcoin adoption, meaning people that are interested and invested in it, is at one place, but the use of the technology is like way freaking behind that place.
It's like
And
archaic,
yeah,
you could argue, or just not, a lot of apathy too.
yeah. So we're using personal computer analogies is easy for me, but we have not reached the stage of Windows. Like, we're in the personal computer
Mm,
era, staring at a DOS prompt.
right.
We are still in that stage in terms of where because technology adoption is in a certain sense often the result of the people developing the technology making it easy and accessible. And we are not there yet. Whether that's, I held up one of these, whether, cold storage is hugely intimidating. Even soft wallets are very intimidating. If you're talking about like real stuff, like running a node, running a Bitcoin node, running a Lightning node, those sort of things, like, we are mountains. We have a whole mountain range to cross before we get to that point. And by the way, we may not get there. That doesn't mean Bitcoin fails, by the way. It just means that it may never be adopted in the masses from a technological standpoint, in part because there just aren't enough people motivated to go down that path. So it said, even if the technology is made much easier to use, I'm not 100% sure that we get massive adoption.
Mm,
Now, what's one side of it, say, well, is what's paramount is that the option always be there for people to run a node and to do base layer transactions and use Lightning in a non-custodial form and like those sort of things. But maybe we don't get there. That doesn't mean that's what I desire, but I try to be realistic about some of these things too, and part of that, I'm sure we'll talk about it later, is, hey, the base layer is really a scarce commodity. And so as time goes by, if personal adoption doesn't come fast enough, the corporate adoption will crowd out and use up most of the block space, and individuals won't ever have had their chance. Now we have that chance now, but we may not in the future. And there's something I say, and by the way, I don't want to go too far off your adoption question, but I'll say this, and then maybe we can come back to it. Most people in the Bitcoin community, and I would assume if they're listening to your show, they're in the Bitcoin community, they've heard the word subsidy before. And they think of the subsidy, I'd say on the whole, as the reward paid to miners for doing their work and the method by which new issuance occurs. Okay. True. Those are true statements. However, that's not holistically true. And I think this is the part that people miss. The subsidy is also for users of Bitcoin, to give them a period of time in which they can have unlimited access for free. I'm going to use those terms loosely. Unlimited access for free to the base layer. But those days are ending. Maybe they are over already, or we're definitely in the sunset period of that. And so to the degree people don't take advantage of that, it's their own fault. But the network does not owe users unlimited access for free to the base layer, which is what they've had. The network doesn't owe that to anybody. And it's a great privilege to have this period that we've experienced for the last 15 years. But it is just that. And there's a danger, I think. I wish I could attribute the quote to the right person, but the quote is, "A luxury once enjoyed becomes a necessity." And I think that you could also extend that to say, a luxury once enjoyed becomes an entitlement. Mm-hmm. Or you have this expectation that you'll always get it. Well, that's not the way the world works. And as the rest of the world, whether that's the corporate world, whether that's nation states, whatever, as they adopt Bitcoin and they value Bitcoin, I promise you they are going to value the block space properly. And they're going to realize the finite nature of it. And they're going to use a whole bunch of it. and because there's only 53,000 blocks a year, there's nothing we're going to ever do, in my opinion, that will change that number. The battle for those 53,000 blocks and who controls those blocks and who controls what goes in those blocks, it's going to be a big frickin' deal. So I think that, it'll go back to your question, like, where are we on adoption and, technological adoption? We're at a very poor state. I mean, we're increasing Bitcoin adoption, but the technological adoption of Bitcoin is really lagging hard. And like I said, like the personal computer, there was an era in the late 80s into the early 90s when we were still staring at a DOS prompt, a Microsoft DOS prompt. And, if you wanted to copy a file, you had to You had to go into the command line and you would, identify the disk drive that the source file was on and type the name of the source file and then copy it to this floppy disk, floppy disk B. I'm sure you did that at some point, Cedric. Some of the younger crowd probably never has, but you did that. And now we live in a world where no, you just drag and drop the file you want into the folder you want. Well, there was a long path from between those 2 points. But since you're talking about adoption, I think it's an interesting, not necessarily technological adoption, but we look at Bitcoin adoption. I had an interesting, I think at least interesting observation out of Nashville. You and I, a little before the show, were talking about Nashville. We were both in Nashville for Bitcoin 2024. And it was a big show. I've heard the number around 25,000 people. I believe that's approximately right. So big event, probably the biggest event in the history of Bitcoin. So that's cool. But I'll make this statement and then I'll reverse it. The day will come when Bitcoin adoption is so pervasive that nobody goes to the Bitcoin conference anymore. Sounds like an oxymoron, or like that doesn't make sense, right? You'd think, no, it should get bigger and bigger and bigger as adoption gets stronger, but it actually is the opposite. So I'll tell you the way this played out in the personal computer industry. In 1979, which would be even before the introduction of the IBM PC, but it was coming, it was close, right? There was a show called Comdex. It was held in Las Vegas. Actually, it was held in a couple different cities, but primarily in Las Vegas.
Sheldon Adelson made a lot of, I think he was one of the founders of that. It was
Correct.
the origin of his money before he got into the hotel and gambling business in Vegas.
That's correct.
And then,
yeah, very good that you.
And he came out of the I think he was a cab driver out of Boston before that.
I don't know that part of the story.
Maybe his dad was, I don't know, but he was a hard scrabble guy before all of it. But I think he got his go with Comdex.
Yeah. And I believe I went to my first Comdex in 1987. And by then it was in Las Vegas. And I believe at the time it was on the order of maybe 15 or 20,000 people. So big show, not unlike the Bitcoin show in Nashville. Here's an astounding number, though. By 1998, the show attracted 225,000 people, 225,000 attendees for one conference. So 9 times bigger than Bitcoin Nashville, which if you're out there listening and you were at Bitcoin Nashville, it's probably a little bit difficult to fathom what that means. And it takes a city like Las Vegas to pull that off, because this was not only the Las Vegas Convention Center, which is massive, and every square inch of it filled with exhibitors and presenters and seminars, but also the ballrooms of the Sands Hotel and the MGM and the Caesars and like everything like that. There was not a hotel room within 60 miles, and it was unbelievable. But so remember, that's 1998. This is the fascinating part. By 2004, the show was dead. I mean, literally, they didn't hold it anymore. So what happened between 1998 and 2004? Well, what happened was in 1998, it was kind of the pinnacle of the personal computer. Microsoft came out with a new operating system that year called Windows 98. You might remember that, Cedric.
Yeah.
We're now within a year and a half of Y2K, which was this, everybody's already freaking out about Y2K and if the world's going to end. Intel is now cranking out new processors at a great rate. We're now creating PCs that have like DVD players in them and writable DVD, and this whole world of video production and all that is starting to happen. So all these things are happening. Like the excitement is just so amazing. And the technology adoption, the part we were talking about before, is through the roof. We went from probably in the early 90s every middle class home in America probably having one PC to the end of the decade to basically every adult having their own. Like, and most teenagers even. Like if you were in
Right.
a middle class family, you cobbled together the money and each person wanted their own
Right.
PC. And we've also gone from AOL and dial up and walled garden type stuff to now, these online things starting to happen. So all of this happened, but amazingly, this is the amazing part. By 2004, it's dead. Well, what happened was, well, obviously the personal computer industry was still massive, but it just had lost all of its excitement. It was like, um, it was like there's nothing new. Like it's like a rock star, a rock band. They've run out of gas,
Right.
and like nobody wanted to go anymore, right? They weren't putting out any more great music anymore, and the world wasn't ready for the reunion tour. Like there's just like nothing exciting going on, and so nobody wanted to go to Vegas anymore. So my 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 thought about it is that we we might realize that one of the indicators of Bitcoin kind of making it and kind of reaching critical mass within society is when we really see less of things like Bitcoin meetups and Bitcoin conferences and Bitcoin seminars, and the podcast circuit maybe has waned. No, I don't think this is short term, right? This is kind of, again, maybe projecting some of my technologist stuff. But this point will happen. And that means we won, right? The goal of
Mm.
being the base layer of money, of being pervasive in society. And that doesn't mean there won't be little, as you said, like there might be a little seminar on, like you were talking about the bonds or something like that, I think
Sure.
earlier. Like, yeah, there may be.
There'll be iterations of technology that come off. Hardware wallets might be a thing, a conference around that, or
Right.
privacy, or personal servers or something. There'll be niche things, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's kind of
It'll
weird.
become supplurious. Bitcoin will just be money also. So people will just be using it and they won't need to go to a conference to understand it. It's like we don't have a conference for
Yeah,
microwaves anymore. I'm sure when they rolled it
basically.
out, people got really excited about it at trade
Yeah.
shows.
Yeah.
Now we just use them. You don't have to convince the wholesaler and the retail and the distributor why they need to put microwaves in the store and get it into consumers.
Yeah. And so that's not a bad thing. And so I say to
Right.
people too, like, enjoy this time.
Mm.
Like I had such a phenomenal time in the 90s, especially like the late 80s and the 90s in the personal computer market. It was exciting for me personally. The community was exciting. The technology was exciting. I honestly never thought I would find that again in my life. I feel like
Mm.
greatly, greatly blessed to have found Bitcoin and to get a second ride like that. Um, but it won't last forever. And again, that like I look back at my PC days with great fondness and feel I'm proud of the contributions I made. And I think in small ways they still out there. Like people, everybody that has an iPhone or an Android phone or a device, like one of the inventions I have, there's billions of devices out there that have a little piece of me and my idea in them because of this headphone thing. And that's something I take. I don't want to sound. I don't want to be prideful, but I don't know. I don't know a different word, right? That gives me a lot of satisfaction, like that occurred, and and just the fact of being in the early days of the personal computer and helping that thing go immense. And I think I'll look back at Bitcoin in the same way, like regardless of what my financial reward is, that I played a part. And you play a part here with education and your show. And I think there's a lot of people out there looking for a way to make a mark. And there's a lot of ways to make a mark and be part of it. But this is a really, like, really blessed anybody that's here to be part of it. And like I always find it interesting that um there's a lot of this. I hope this doesn't come off critical, but it's something I don't completely understand. Like, I think there are some really bright people out there that are, let's say, part of the Bitcoin Twitter community, but they're completely anonymous, and they really hide in this anonymity. And I go, well, that kind of prevents you from really making the big mark. Like, and I respect your right to be private if you're out there and that's you, but like, I want to make a mark on the world. Like, I want to make the world better. I want my grandkids, who are my oldest grandkids now 13, and I'm really happy, much like I'd say like maybe a ball player, a baseball player or something. Oh, I'm so happy that my kids are old enough to see me play in the big leagues. Well, I have a version of that. Like, hey, I'm really happy that my grandkids and my kids who are in their 20s and 30s now, like, well, they get to see me do something, because when I was in the PC market, they were all too small. They didn't get to see me make my mark on the world there. But now, if I'm on your show, or I'm on, I don't know, Peter McCormick's show or something like that, oh, that was my grandpa, or that's my dad. And, they know that I'm doing something um, uh, meaningful in the world. Right.
Right.
That's what I want for them ultimately too. Right.
Right. And now you're running for vice president. I'm kidding
Yeah.
there, but to get back to serious note, I think on the privacy side, I was a NIM before I started the show. I think the obvious retort that I don't want to get mud thrown in our faces, Satoshi was private. He made an incredible mark on the world. And I think privacy plays a big part in free speech and what we hear in the marketplace of ideas. But sort of what you were saying, I found it very hard to start the show as a NIM and attract guests and sort of and so I wanted to contribute, and I thought the show was the best way for me to do that in the space. And so I changed from a NIM to said Youngman, and went to do it. But
Yeah.
I think what's also interesting there, you mentioned sort of personal computing over the years. And I remember my mom was a public school teacher, but I was really lucky. We got a Apple IIc or IIe in the mid 80s. And in the early 90s, we had we still might have had a Mac or maybe a PC, but I remember taking those discs that I would get in the mail and getting into AOL and all the other ones. But AOL was the only one with people in it, and kind of adopting that technology. I remember going to college, part of my scholarship, where we got a computer in our suite. So it wasn't for me, but that was the era of everyone of IMAX rolling out the colorful computers for college kids. And you're saying all the teenagers get it. And then like 2004, I was actually in Seattle for a small project where we had secret shoppers go around the world to buy Microsoft computers. And then we brought them back to Seattle, and we had, testers to test how fast they turned on, and how fast they booted, how fast this screen came up and that screen. And, based on the results of that, all the distributors would get sort of their rebates and bonuses and sort of back end deals for performance, and the way we would validate that performance. But my point here is that, over those years, from Apple to Microsoft, Dell, I mean, these stalwarts are still around in huge ways. So, my next question is like, do you think the Bitcoin giants of today are they likely to be the Bitcoin giants of tomorrow?
No, they're not. And obviously those ones survive, so their names.
Right.
Right. But would you know a name? You might, but people of today wouldn't. For instance, a name like Compaq, CAMPAC.
Calculators and
No, they were personal computers.
that's Hewlett Packard I'm thinking of. But yeah, no, I know the name
Hewlett
Compaq.
Packard ended up buying Compaq when they ran
Okay,
into
maybe that's why the
But-
merger probably.
But they were they came out around 85, 86 with what were called luggable computers, which were a big thing about it as a suitcase that's a computer. So it didn't have a battery in it, but you could pick it up and move it from place to place, right? And so they were kind of the pioneer of that, and it actually became desktop. By the early 90s, they were the biggest personal computer company in the world. By the end of the decade, they were dead. IBM, which invented the personal computer, in 1984, at least the one we would consider the personal computer. Apple might have an issue with this, but the traditional Microsoft Intel based thing was invented by IBM in 1984. They were number one in the world through the 80s. By about 2000, they were dead. They were out of the business. And the list of really prominent companies, whether they were personal computer companies or makers of hard disks or software or whatever, they largely failed. Because I think when you look back at it, what you see is that surviving in a high growth industry where you have to continually stay at the edge of the innovation curve, where your financial health has to stay impeccable, it's really, really hard. So my company, Gateway, which we had a great ride, we ended up not making it. We ended up purchased by Acer, but we made it for a long time. And so imagine this. Imagine like when I joined around 1990, it's about when I started getting involved. Well, it's when they bought roughly the era when I started working with them with this personal computer I talked about with the Japanese, right? I did that for about a year and a half, and then Gateway bought that product, and then I moved in with them. So I guess technically I was with Gateway starting in 92. Anyway, in that era, we were a couple $100 million company, profitable, maybe 800 employees, let's say in that era. 8 years later, in 2000, we went from 800 employees to 25,000 employees. We went from several hundred million in annual revenue to 10 billion. So we had to manage that growth. And managing that growth is really, really difficult, right? You're not only reinventing yourself once or twice, you're reinventing your processes, who you hire, what you're hiring
So many
for,
fronts.
like so many fronts.
Yeah,
And that's
your
the only
back
way.
office, your distribution, your ERP systems, your financing, whether you go
Yeah,
debt, equity, your balance sheet management, capital raising. I mean, it's really
yeah,
M&A activity. It's
right,
a lot of fronts. Your HR
right.
department is quadrupling. Yeah.
Yeah. And you've got new personalities coming in. You're trying to preserve a corporate culture and a style. In our case, those 25,000 people went from the 800 people were all people living in either Iowa or South Dakota. At 25,000 people, we're in like 14 or 15 countries. We have manufacturing facilities on 4 continents. So radical changes. And we made it through that. Like, I'm very proud of that. We made it that far. And, for me to survive that, I'm very proud of it too, because I what would happen is we'll use the CFO. You have a financial background, right? So you take a role like CFO. Well, the CFO of the company in 1992 we were pre-public. We're not a public company yet. And we're doing a few $100 million in revenue. A lot. It's a big job. We're doing all our transactions in one currency, dollars, right? Even 3 years later, we're public. We're now a couple billion. We have 3 times the employee base. We now have manufacturing facilities in Ireland and Malaysia. The complexity of just being the CFO. Well, the truth of the matter was CFO didn't make it.
Right. Yeah. You're going to bring in a new guy who has all those skills.
Yeah. And then
And it's
he ended
cutthroat.
up not 2 years later. Now now instead of being a Fortune 1000 company, now we're a Fortune 500 company. And, we've got a market cap of several billion, now dealing with the Wall Street analysts and the funds that are investing in us and like all that. I mean, that's a whole different. So anyway, that ended up not being the guy. And
Right.
then we hit 10 billion. Now we're a Fortune 200 company. Like that's how big we got. We got inside the Fortune 200 with 10 billion in revenue. And we had things like we bought a bank so we could do our own financing, like to extend credit for people to buy computers. Like just an example of, given your background, like the complexity of all of that stuff. And so to keep that ship moving that direction, go through all those changes, it's really hard. It's very rare, by the way, that the CEO, like we had one CEO through that whole thing, and we had one president through that whole thing. Pretty special people, to be able to do that. Now, the special nature of the people, like the president, was a guy named Rick Snyder. And the reason some of you that name might resonate with you, when he left Gateway, he became the two-term governor of the state of Michigan.
Mm.
So that's the quality of the people,
Right.
To be able to run that through that transition, the president COO.
Huge personalities, I imagine, as well.
Yeah. I was very fortunate that at least the survivor, so I survived that whole run. I maintained and moved up through that. And Rick was there. The head of procurement, a guy named Dave Russell, who's a good friend, he made through that whole transition. Ted, the CEO, did. But HR, finance, marketing, sales, all those organizations, they were they were just churning people, because we'd hire people and you'd hire somebody for the moment, but the job would almost outgrow them before they've settled into their chair, because we were growing so quickly. Well, kind of going back to the topic, when you're in that world, a setback is almost always fatal. So, and I think Bitcoin will be similar. Like if you have a setback, if the market loses confidence in you, it doesn't have time for you to reassemble the troops and get things back together. So, what I see, and I don't want to call out specific people, what I see is, for the most part, we have inside the name companies, most of the name companies in the Bitcoin space, we don't have people that have been through this before. And we're going to find a few people who have the skills like Ted Waite and Rick Snyder, who were in my company, did, to grow personally, to have egos that allow them to continually hire people that are better than them at something. But it's pretty rare, because what you find is a lot of times the most successful early entrepreneurs, the very driven mindset, the personality of these people, that start something and drive it, comes with a certain narcissism and ego. I don't mean that in a super critical way, but that makes it difficult for them to be the guy all the way. They're good in this early stage, but can they morph to be the guy later? Because here's what's really hard. A company finds it successful. It goes from nothing to maybe being worth a few $100 million. And then is that guy ready to take them to the promised land, whether that's an IPO or to a couple $1 billion valuation? Well, it may be that person who often owns a lot of the company and has a lot of control of the board has to say, you know what, I'll step back. I'll become chairman of the board. I'm going to bring somebody in that can take me through. That's really hard. The other thing is, it's kind of the Kodak scenario where companies are successful at something and it has a window, right? They're successful with it, but there's a new technology out there that can obsolete what they're doing. And will they have the courage to create that new technology and obsolete themselves, which might mean killing the golden cow, right? Yeah. And That's the Kodak story that you probably heard, but you know, the story of Kodak was the leaders of Kodak was a camera company, and they were the largest processors of film, and they actually invented digital photography, but they refused to bring it to market because they were making so much money in the film. And like you're
Right.
old, like it used to be, if there was a shopping mall, there would be a little hut in the parking lot, and it would be this little one person kiosk,
Mhm.
and you could drop your film off into the kiosk,
In a little
and you
baggie.
could in a little baggie, and you know, depending on whether or not you wanted 1 hour service or 24-hour service, or you know, whatever, you drop it off. But if you wanted the 1 hour service, because like it was, I don't know, somebody's birthday party the day before, and you're so excited to get these 20 photos back, you know, so
Right.
you drop it off and you pay the expedite fee, and you go in and you do a little shopping, and then you come out and you get the photos, and you know, you'd sit in the car and look at the photos, and you know, you'd get like three good ones.
Right. They'd all be overexposed, or you'd have the lens cap on the whole time, and you know,
Yeah,
I'm so
yeah,
excited to get these.
yeah.
I remember 24 hours or 1 hour. That was even like later on. It used to be like a week or 2 weeks, I think, at the
Oh
local
yeah,
pharmacy. And then those little boots came out, and that was like the technological innovation, bringing a dark room closer to your house. Yeah, I remember that. I mean, I grew up in all of that, and then you get a digital camera, and it's like, how many things can this take? And I still to this day, I take 20 shots of the same thing because I'm like, these are disposable. I could just find the one that we're not blinking in,
right.
and take endless, photos. Um, yeah, it really is interesting that way. In terms of where things are going, we kind of talked a bit about the value of block space,
Yeah.
and you kind of phrase it as sort of a commodity in that regards. But maybe a way to start kind of getting into this is, what is the split between fees and subsidy for each block on average?
All right. Historically, so if we take the whole last 15 years, the average is about 98% and 2%. So 98% of the revenue from the block reward has been subsidy, and about 2% has been fees. In 2023, that upticked, was more like 6% fees. So it was a marked change. Now, interestingly, it's down again. We're running down more closer to the historical norm. 2023, different side, like, certainly because of what happened with ordinals, inscriptions, and all that, it drove some of the fee market higher. But even though I'm not a fan of those things, what I think it did was it was a precursor. It shows how quickly the fee market responds to the change in demand for block space. And it's a non-linear response. So meaning that as because there's no ability for the commodity, which is block space, to respond to the change in demand, it has the same exponential reaction as Bitcoin does, right? So if 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 we if we see adoption move in a positive direction, it will have a very disproportionate effect on the fee market. We're at a point now where block space is already extremely scarce. So it's been almost 18 months since the mempool cleared. For those who aren't familiar, so what happens is, if I'm going to send Cedric some Bitcoin right now, a true Bitcoin transaction, I I sign the transaction, I present it or broadcast that to the network, and it goes into the mempool. Okay. It's kind of like a check that has been signed but not cleared the bank, or a credit card transaction. The request is at the credit card company, but we didn't get the approval yet. That's the analogous place. Okay. So for 18 months, there's been a backlog there that's never once cleared. And it's typically been about 200,000 transactions at any point in time waiting for that input. It's over that number right now. As of at least earlier today, it's over 200,000 that are waiting. Now, the reason fees haven't gone bonkers yet is that a lot of the transactions are non-economic transactions. They are things like, it's not me buying a car from you. It's I'm withdrawing funds from an exchange. I am consolidating UTXOs. I'm doing a coin join. Okay. Those type of activities don't have an urgency to them. Therefore, they can sit there for a while. But as the adoption moves to something with that's part of a real economic transaction, an exchange of value between two parties, that will change it, because there's almost always an urgency to that, right? And that may be, I need it in the next hour or I need it in the next day, but it's not like, hey, I can wait 3.5 weeks for this thing. That won't happen at all. And that's what we haven't seen. So even a small rise in that will have a massive change in the fee market.
Right. Well, where would the split be in like 10 years? Like how much of the block space will be, or the reward be from subsidy versus fees? Like where is that going?
Well, remember, subsidies, right? So if we look at 10 years, then I would say we'd be at a point where subsidy is basically insignificant. That it's probably 80-20 at that point. I shouldn't say insignificant, but it's probably 80-20. And in 15, it is the subsidy would be by 15 years, the subsidy will be like 0.19 per block, 0.19 Bitcoin per block, right in that range. So it's so small that.
Oh, like 20% of a Bitcoin.
Correct. Per block.
But if a Bitcoin is worth $1 million, you're still talking about 200 grand. But I mean, we could argue, what is 200 grand worth then? But this is not nothing, maybe.
Well, remember that. So this topic has a lot of branches to it, but let's look at it this way. Okay. This year, the Bitcoin rewards in dollar terms will be approximately $13 billion. The subsidy plus the fees that
we can think of that as like the security budget, or like
right.
an operating budget of some sort.
Right.
It's not SG&A.
Right. So it's honestly not that big. It's not that big a number, right? You know, Gateway, one top 5, like the 5th
Right.
biggest personal computer company in the year 2000, was basically the same size.
Right. Right.
So it's not that big, right? And if you compare it, like I did a little study of like how much money does Bank of America spend on IT? And it's a little murky, but it's somewhere in the $10 billion a year range. So one of the larger banking institutions annually is spending about the same.
Right. And that doesn't include the electricity bill or the probably the
Right.
leases or the rent or the mortgage or whatever the financing is and all of it.
Yeah, that's the servers and the cloud service fees and the, all those sorts. So it's tiny, right? So even if we're at 0.19, I'm gonna do a little math here as we're talking. If we do 0.19 per block and there's 53,000 blocks, that's only 10,000 Bitcoin per year. Okay. That's the new issuance, but it's also the security budget. So even at $1 million, even at $1 million Bitcoin, that is 10 billion. Correct? So it's not that big, right? The subsidy relative to where we have to be. Now, if we're going to have a secure network 10 years from now, we're going to need like a 150 to 250 billion-dollar budget. And that's speaking in 2024 dollar terms. I don't know what dollar terms are out there, right?
Yeah.
In net present terms, it's all going to have to come from fees. Right. So there's some people, I talk a lot about this publicly, and there's some people that tell me that I'm full of shit, that fees are never going to go high, and that one sat is going to be worth so much money that, uh, we'll be doing transactions for 1 or 2 sats per V byte. And I go, well, no, the math doesn't play out, because if you back into this the way we just did and said, hey, let's just say we need a $200 billion budget to defend Bitcoin in that time period. Well, we're going to need $190 million in fees from the network at that point. Well, I've done the math on that. That means we're going to be more like 150 sats per V byte for a transaction. Right. People are moaning right now when it's 15 sats per V byte. And I'm telling you, it's going to be 10 times more.
So, maybe going further, how is block space finite, and how is that different from being scarce?
Okay. Yeah, another thing, I think some people have an issue with my take on this, because they'll say, no, block space is finite. There's always another block. And say, well, there's some truth to that. However, all of us are time bound. I have a finite life left. The year has a certain number of hours or days in it. And in any of those windows, it's finite. Okay. It's every 10 minutes, right? There's nothing we're going to do that changes how fast the blocks come. I think that's set in stone. I think some people may try to change that. We can talk about that later, but I believe that number is probably set in stone. And the size of the block, well, we already had the block size wars. I don't think we have an appetite in the community for another one for a long, long time. So 53,000 blocks a year. That's what 10-minute block times will give you. Actually, slightly less than 10-minute block times will give you 53,000 blocks a year. There are 4 million weight units. For those that don't know what that means, just think about it as about 4,000 transactions. It's about what it'll fit in there. So you have 4,000 transactions, 53,000 blocks. That's just over 200 million transactions annually. To me, that's finite. That's finite, and it's scarce. And there's nothing the demand side can do to force a change in that number. That's the protocol. It's the way that it sits. So if you believe I'm right, or even partially right, that demand is going up, it's going up on an annual basis against that. And again, remember this urgency, I think I talked about before, because again, you come from an accounting background. So you're forced as a business to do your business in time windows, right? There's an urgency to it. Like you're not going to sit there if a customer is trying to pay you for goods or services. You're not going to just say, oh, well, let's just wait until that transaction clears. No, you want your money, right? Now, and you may not even be willing to perform your service or release your goods to your customer until you are paid. Depends on what business you're in. You may have quarters and calendar and fiscal periods to close. So, like, it's my belief that, for instance, the last week of December, acquiring block space in the last week of December will be face-meltingly expensive as soon as we get just a tiny bit of corporate adoption. Because the urgency with which transactions occur in that period is so important. Whether that's for capital gains reasons, whether that's because, like, hey, if I have a warehouse, if I'm a company and I'm transacting in Bitcoin and I have a bunch of widgets in my warehouse and it's December 27th and I have a buyer, I need that frickin', you know, Bitcoin transaction to close before December 31st. I need, I need to release the goods. I need my balance sheet to show a lower inventory level and a higher,
Right.
higher cash level, assuming Bitcoin is considered a cash equivalent at the time, right? Like those are going to be super, super important things. And so those that control the block space of that time period will be in a very powerful position, and they will want to monetize that.
Yeah. So thinking about that, the monetization of block space, I think right away you could think about selling block space
Yeah,
and block space derivatives.
right.
So, I mean, is this here now? And, where do you see this going?
I've been working on it for quite a while. And in fact, with a group called Block Spaces out of Tampa, not far from where you are physically. And this, I believe, is probably the most exciting new commodity to hit the world in a long, long time, probably other than Bitcoin, right? So I think if you think of block space as a commodity, then as you said, it's a natural extension that you need these sort of things. So I'll put it this way. Let's kind of go to a natural commodity market that's easy for people to understand. If I am a farmer, I'm sitting there in Missouri, okay, and I plant a bunch of soybeans. Now, if I do that in April and I'm going to harvest in October, I might look at the price of October soybeans and say, hey, that looks like a pretty good price. I can be profitable selling my soybeans at that price. So the farmer can say, let me take 20% of my harvest and my projected harvest, and I'm going to sell a contract to the market, offer a contract to the market, $6 a bushel. I have no idea if that's a good price for soybeans or not, but $6 a bushel. Okay. Now on the other side, there's somebody who uses soybeans, and I don't know, Kikkoman soy sauce needs soybeans to make soy sauce. Okay. So they go and say, hey, for our October production, it's April, our October production, we want to start locking in our cost of production now. We want to know, one, that we can get them. And number two, we want to know what the price is. So they buy the contract. Okay. Now, the soybean producer is obligated at the end to produce soybeans to the owner of the contract. Now, they have the right to trade that contract. Kikkoman might eventually say, well, we don't want the soybeans, or for whatever reason we can get a better deal. We'll sell this, whatever. And there'll be traders and speculators who also might buy these. But the traders and speculators ultimately must sell them to somebody who's going to buy them, because there's stories about this, right? Where if you're a trader and you buy apples or wheat or gold or whatever, you got to have if you haven't sold the contract, you're getting the goods.
Delivery. Yeah.
Okay. So given that as a background, what we have is we have a market. We have a seller looking to stabilize revenue streams and know that they can lock in something that they can live with. And you have a buyer who needs to assure availability and assure cost. Okay. So now let's talk block space. Block space is exactly the same way. You have producers of block space. Those are today it's the pools that will shift to the miners. We can talk about why. But the producers of the block space will want to find future buyers and stabilize revenues, especially as the percentage of the revenue they're generating is more fee-based and less subsidy-based. Right now, they can handle it. The volatility doesn't have, they basically don't count on fees at all. If you're a miner today, you kind of say, I'm going to assume there's no fees, build my business plan around it. And if they go up really high, wonderful, I make more money, but I got to learn to survive without it. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, very different. Like they can't count on the subsidy for jack shit. They have to um, count on the fees, but the fees could be highly volatile. So they'll want to lock that in. So that's what we're creating. And I think it's a natural maturity point for the industry. In fact, I would go so far as to say Bitcoin cannot fulfill its vision without products like this, without this opportunity. Because as much as probably the average Bitcoiner would bemoan big banks and big corporations getting into Bitcoin, we don't hyper Bitcoinize without it. Like we can't assume it, oh, it's just the 8 billion people in the world that are going to use Bitcoin, and we're going to lock out the 330 million companies of the world, and we're going to lock out the financial institutions, and we're going to lock out the nation states. Like it doesn't work that way, right? You kind of have to live the Bitcoin is for everybody, even your enemy, stance, and then say, okay, well, what does it take for them to get in? And this is what they're going to need. They're going to need that financial security and know that they have access to it. Because if not, they'll stay in the fiat system. Because the fiat system serves them decently today. I hate it. Obviously, I'm here in the Bitcoin world. I hate it. But from their perspective, it serves them okay. They can send a wire. The transaction I talked about before, it's December 27th. I got a warehouse full of widgets. My financials are going to look terrible if I don't complete this sale. My balance sheet's going to look terrible if I don't commit this sale. Well, okay, just wire me some fiat and all is well, right? So they know how to play that game. There is, by the way, almost no limitation on the number of transactions of that system. So that's one advantage it has, is like even on December 27th, you might have some of the bank personnel in the wire department working overtime that time of year, but they'll get it done. We don't have that capability, at least at the base layer.
It's interesting thinking about, slicing and dicing block space. What have you learned sort of from your experience in Asia, maybe from like Japanese group purchasing agreements and how they might deal with block space in sort of a non-economic fashion, or not just to maximize return of, on price?
Yeah. Well, I think what you're referring to is like when I worked for Mitsui, or at least in their offices, and they were our investor. I learned about this system called the Keiretsu system. And in the Keiretsu system, what you have is a large financial services company that creates a community of companies within their own system that creates a mini economy. So they will do things like you'll have a car company, an electronics company, and a steel company that all sit within the Keiretsu. So let's say those three companies all are customers of a company like Mitsui. Now, the car company and the electronics company buy all their steel from the steel company. The steel company and the electronics company buy all their vehicles from the car company. They all use the computers of the electronics company, just as an example. Now, the reason that they do that is they build a system where the Keiretsu head, like in this case, Mitsui, owns part of all three of those companies. And then all three of those companies own fractional percentages. I should say fractional percentages, but maybe like 5% or 7%, a material amount, not a controlling interest, in each other. So you get this very incestuous sort of thing. So they don't have to buy from each other, but they always do. And they do all of their banking, all their financial services are provided through Mitsui in this case as part of that. So if I were in charge of Mitsui right now, one of the things I would be doing is I would say, hey, I'm going to create a mining division. And the goal of my mining division is to control a certain number of blocks based on the capacity of my network needs. Right now, it might be a small one. Say, well, I want to have enough mining that once a week I can include all the transactions of my network. And I don't care what's going on in the rest of the network. I don't care how expensive the fees being offered by others are. I'm going to put in the transactions of my member companies in at the lowest possible fees. So it's not about them making money as a miner. It's them maintaining control of this economy and keeping them vested. And I think what will happen is we're going to see affiliate groups emerge. And like an example might be American Express. Okay, so another incarnation of this idea would be, think 10 years from now, you're American Express. You've got these high net worth people who are members of your card. Maybe they have the black card as an example. So if you're a American Express black card holder, then one of the benefits of holding that black card could be that you get 20 annual base layer transactions processed by American Express. So again, American Express, they could care less how many sats per V-byte you offered those transactions for, but they're going to just say, no, we want you as a customer. And so we're going to give you this preferred access to the network when you need it. And I think you'll find large banks, a Citigroup, a JP Morgan, et cetera. I think they will become miners. And what they will say is, hey, why don't, if Mr. Fortune 500 company, if you do your banking with us, we're going to offer you preferred access to block space. If you believe what I'm saying is that a lot of people look at the Bitcoin mining incentives and they think about it in a very myopic way. They think about the miners as being motivated purely from the perspective of earning the block reward. And what I'm saying is, I don't think that will be the case in the future. I think they will look at it in a completely different set of perspectives, at least a material part of the mining network. And they're going to look at it as like, hey, if the world economy is running on top of Bitcoin, then access to the block space is existential to them. So they're going to need either partnerships with miners or they will need their own mining operations in order to really secure those positions. And so that changes things dramatically for the way the Bitcoin network will work and the way that individual people will be able to interact with it. Some people hate this vision, by the way, and I understand that. I'm not saying I like it. I am not promoting it. But we talked earlier about, being a technologist. This is what I see. This is how I see the world adopting Bitcoin. And while I hate it, because I think what it will do is it make it almost impossible for the average person to interact with any regularity with the base layer. Be extremely rare event. It will mean Bitcoin is being utilized as a major instrument. We have a major pieces of the world economy running on it. Now, the next piece of that, though, is now let's talk about the nation state level. So that's kind of the next order effect. So now you say, well, if today we have this monetary system where you often hear the term in the Bitcoin world, like the Fed is the single node of the monetary system, right? Well, that gives tremendous power to the US, and unfortunately, the US has exercised that power, in my mind, in a very bad way. Even the actions with Russia and Iran and North Korea, I think by excluding them and using as a weapon, they get a short-term benefit for a long-term detriment. Because the message it sends to these other countries is, even the ones that we're friendly with today, is you're just one bad statement or one bad relationship between, that country and the US from either getting your assets seized or at least being excluded from being able to move money around the world. So Bitcoin offers an alternative to that, but only if that company has access to block space. So one of the things I've talked about is I'd say, if I was running Bolivia right now, or use an example, Bhutan. Like Bhutan, I think, is making a brilliant move. What Bhutan is doing is it's protecting the long-term financial sovereignty of its nation by mining Bitcoin. And because they mine, they will be able to control blocks. And so they'll be able to, for their government and theoretically for the citizens and companies of their country, they will always be able to provide access to the base layer of Bitcoin and be able to do commerce. So what I would do, like if I was, I mentioned Bolivia, if I'm the head of Bolivia right now, which has almost no mining, but I would be going to the rest of the world and I would be trying to attract investments in mining. And what I would do is I would say, hey, you come here, you bring your hash rate, you build this out. We're going to give you tax breaks. We're going to give you energy at the lowest possible cost. One caveat. The caveat is we've created Bolivia Pool, and you must point your hash rate at Bolivia Pool, and the government of Bolivia or the central bank of Bolivia is going to decide what transactions go in blocks for their pool. So when they win blocks, it's always the blocks that they care about that get in. And that's the only way to have sovereignty in the future. So these countries, like I just saw Norway is now pushing some initiatives to ban mining and go, man, that is really, really freaking dangerous. That now is the time for countries to build mining infrastructure. And I think every sovereign nation needs to build some mining infrastructure, because without it, even if they only believe Bitcoin has a 1% chance of becoming the base layer of money, if they don't build that mining infrastructure out right now, they may not have a nation. I mean, you literally could be blocked out of the global economy if you didn't have it. Or at a minimum, you become subservient and dependent to other parties being kind to you and including your transactions.
Yeah, I mean, this is really interesting. So what it brings up to me though is like Russia just announced, I think they were getting into Bitcoin mining. And you
Yeah.
kind of commented, not only are they going to get a bunch of coins, but they're going to control a bunch of block space.
Yeah.
And it kind of seemed like you were saying, the control of block space will give, immense power and I guess responsibility, but like, I don't know what you mean by responsibility there, maybe being fair and just, but maybe to kind of build on that. I mean, do you think wars will be fought over block spaces? Will alliances be formed over this outside, between countries? I mean, you kind of mentioned the sort of an internal alliance of citizens and
Yeah.
constituents. Is it going to be fought over like water wars and oil wars? Other great commodities of humanity.
I would say yes. And I think that if we look at Russia, for instance, that the US, Biden specifically, used the monetary system as a weapon against Russia. And in my mind, with very limited success. It definitely inflicted some pain. The asset seizure and locking them out of the monetary system caused it, but they've already largely worked around it. And as you said, Putin is understanding that he has this massive asset, which is energy. Number one, he's got a lot of energy. And number two, he can utilize it not only to acquire Bitcoin, but to create this sovereignty. So, and it doesn't take a lot, right? So if Russia acquires 5 to 10% of the world's mining, I think it's very reasonable for them to achieve that level. They are going to control 5 to 8 blocks per day. And they are absolutely going to set up a system that prioritizes the transactions that are beneficial to their country. Now, as that happens, and other countries follow suit, I believe that in and of itself is almost a form of warfare. If you remember Jason Lowery's work in software, I'm somewhat building on some of those sort of thoughts here, or extending those thoughts a little further to say, like, he talks about the hash force or some of those sort of things. What I'm saying is it's really not about the hash rate, it's about the block control. That's really what it's about, is controlling the block space. And I know acquiring the Bitcoin is important, but at a nation state level, it's not even so much the Bitcoin that's in their treasury, but the block space that they control, because that allows their economy to run. It's the engine, it's the toll road of the whole thing. And so owning that and building that, I think, and right now, and being ahead of the curve, is almost more important than stocking the Bitcoin itself at the sovereign level, the nation state level. So that said, if in the future you wanted to attack a country like Russia that maybe had that, the attack on their mining facilities would be a logical thing, right? If you impair that and you take them out, well, you impair a whole bunch of their capabilities in the world. Now, you can do that electronically. You could try, but you also, if you're deciding where to drop a bomb, that's really the way to inflict the damage. Because if you do it in the virtual sense, it's pretty hard to impair it for any extended period of time. So I think warfare may move to bombing the mining sites themselves, or the infrastructure that supports those.
I find this so fascinating. Admittedly, I didn't go down the Jason Lowery rabbit hole. He didn't want to talk to me, so I didn't put in the time to do the work to prep for a show. But I on one hand, of one mind, I think like game theory, and you say, I think, oh, okay, well, we wouldn't bomb each other's mining capabilities because we would be too busy building our own, because it would benefit us to mine instead of to work to bomb. And or sort of the Robinson Crusoe thought, we'll have more if we both mine than if I try to blow yours up and you try to blow mine up. But at the same time, back to what you were just saying, I'm like, you got a country who's mining and they got great hash power, and they don't have the capabilities to defend this. Why wouldn't I bomb this? And maybe I could bomb this without using a lot of energy through a cyber attack, or maybe I sneak some spies in who don't have to bring huge missiles. I don't know what it is. But it sounds like there's going to be warfare in the physical world over digital, the hash power in the digital world, or that,
Yeah.
It's where hash power meets the digital world. But like
Yeah.
it's kind of
I
interesting.
wanted to write a novel. Like we talked about, again, being a technologist. And if I was going to write my future sci-fi novel set in the year 2060, let's say. I'm writing a book about, geopolitics in a hyper Bitcoinized world,
Right.
and we have these countries that we don't like or that are enemies, and yeah, it's exactly what I'm attacking because I create this impairment. Now, if I, on the other hand, and I think you and I have talked about this before, a lot of this comes full circle. A lot of people have heard me talk about the type of mining sites that you build. So if you build elephants, which are like big, massive, congregated places where you have hash rate, now you are subject to that attack, right?
Right.
If you build horses, which is what you mentioned in the intro, what we do. So if I build, if I have 200 megawatts of capacity and it's all in one place, pretty easy to drop a bomb and impair it. If I have 200 sites, each of 1 megawatt, spread out over 6 states,
Right.
I force, one, you got to find them,
Right.
much harder to detect where they are.
Yep.
And even if you get 60% of them, I've
Right.
still got some, I can still go, right?
Yep.
So I think that I look at it as, secure. I developed that thought process originally around making Bitcoin as strong as possible, right? That was why I came up with rabbits, horses, elephants. But I realize now, if you take it at this other level and you want to, you look at it as a sovereign tool, protecting the ability of a country to participate in the global economy, it's pretty tough, if you build elephants, right? So, and I think that's what will happen. Like you said, it's a hell of a lot easier to drop one bomb on a 200 megawatt facility and blow the whole thing up than it is to go build enough additional hash power to dilute them
Right.
to the point where they're not
Well,
really
you have the
effective.
one facility. You don't even have to blow up the facility. You have to blow up the singular source of power. I mean, if you get multiple facilities, like you're saying, you have multiple sources of power as well. You're diversifying and decentralizing a lot of different things, along a lot of different threat vectors.
Yeah.
I wonder, I mean, it sounds like in the future, people, the way countries bury data lines, to
Yeah.
protect them from that thing. We blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. They try to protect these kinds of things. I wonder if countries are going to build nuclear power plants for the sole purpose of mining Bitcoin. You still have this end of the threat vector. You could then blow up the country's nuclear power plant, but I would think these are great sources of energy to increase a country's hash rate.
Yeah, it's certainly what it allows you to do, especially if you're in a country with a growing population and you expect it to grow. It allows you to invest in that power production ahead of the population being able to use it, and you have an instant consumer of that. And you could, whether that's nuclear or any other form of energy. But I do think that you'll probably have countries build at least a certain part of the hash infrastructure of the country in almost like a military fashion. Like they might build it into a mountain, right? And have it so that like there's always some level of hash available that they can have access to. And the other thing is the alliance of countries. So we have BRICS today as an example, right? BRICS is forming as an alternative monetary system to the one that kind of runs the world today. I think you'll see those kind of alliances very commonly,
Right.
where so when you think about, so here's what happens. If you're going to build a block template, and we didn't really talk about this, we probably should have. So there's 200,000 transactions sitting in the mempool. Just say right now, right? Let's say a block just got mined. Now, if I'm going to create a template, if I'm going to be a real miner, which means I'm not going to do the hashing, but I'm going to create the block itself and try to mine it. I have to have some criteria by which I pick roughly 4,000 transactions from the 200,000. And I think most Bitcoiners just assume that, oh, I'm just going to pick the quote unquote ones that have offered the highest sats per VByte. And that's the way it's largely worked to date. But I think the algorithm of the future is not that way. And I know I upset people. I've actually published this a little bit. I actually published a little flow chart of this not too long ago. But what I said is, I think what will happen is people will say, well, the first thing I'm going to do is if I've pre-sold block space, I'm going to put the transactions for that pre-sale in. Then I'm going to pick my own transactions, whatever those are. Then I'm going to pick the transactions of my affiliates and my partners. That could be that American Express or Keiretsu example I gave you. Then I might have an accelerator service, meaning, okay, before I just pluck one out of there, I have this service that kind of says people willing to pay a massive premium for specialized service can go in. And then, which is kind of the fifth stage of this, then I'll go pick the most expensive ones. So the thing that people would perceive today as the highest priority, and typically is, becomes the fifth priority in block construction in the future, especially for nation states and financial services companies participating in mining. So now I hope that some independent miners are still out there, kind of more in the classic sense, whether those are individuals or those are companies like Barefoot today that exist, and some percentage of the blocks are being created in that traditional way. But I don't think it's going to be most. I think you're going to see 75% of the blocks created in this other way in a hyper Bitcoinized world. Now, I think the argument is only, is that in 5 years, or is that in 10 years, or is that in 20 years? But I think the only argument is the when, not the if.
Right. And speaking of this sort of lack of diversification in block space, block template creation now, is this an existential risk to Bitcoin?
Yeah, it is. We sit in a system today, there's only 15 pools. So this template creation that we talked about is done by the pools today. So the companies that in the general vernacular of the community, we call mining companies, by the way, including Barefoot, but this would include Riot or CleanSpark or any of, like all these companies essentially attached to a pool. And today we defer the creation of the template to the pool. And so another way to look at it is that the miners are really hashers, and they are subservient to the pools, who are simply renting the hash power from the pool to create the blocks. And today there's only 15 of those companies. We look at the last couple of weeks, there's only 15 different pools that have even created one. And 90% of the blocks come from 6 of the pools, meaning there's really 6 companies that create almost all the blocks in the world. 4 of those are Chinese companies, all basically directly or loosely tied to Bitmain, Foundry, and Luxor. That's the world today. Now, I'm affiliated with Ocean, and I'm on the board there. I'm an investor there. So I always want to, be honest with people about where I'm coming from. I don't believe it blurs my optics. In fact, the reason for me participating in the Ocean thing is because I view this as a really big problem. And it was about a year ago that I found Ocean, or they found me, I guess, however you want to look at it. We started working together to start solve this problem. And the way Ocean's going to try to solve it is by saying, well, the purpose of a pool is really to spread risk. That's the purpose of a pool. It's no different than a lottery. If you and me, Cedric, and 20 other people all wanted to throw, well, we could throw in varying amounts of money. There's a big lotto jackpot, right? And we go, well, hey, I want to put $50 in, I want to put 20, I want to put whatever. We pool the money and say, okay, well, whatever portion of the total pot you put in, if we win the lotto, you get that percentage. It's the same basic concept. That's what a pool is supposed to do. But what's happened is the people within the community that have the hash power have gotten, in my mind, very, very lazy. And they haven't stayed true to Bitcoin. And what they've done is they've said, hey, we're happy to just produce hash rate. We're going to focus on hash rate and the cost of producing the hash rate. And we're going to let all this other stuff that really is the Bitcoin part, we're going to let the pool make all those decisions. And interestingly, we're not even going to take a stance about it. Now, the risk that presents is that, one, if there's only 6 real points at which transaction selection is taking place, and those 6 pools are coming out of 2 countries, it's pretty easy for those 2 countries to force censorship upon those pools. So that's one problem. Second problem is if you look at the way activations have occurred in the Bitcoin world, like SegWit or Taproot being the recent examples, they are activated through the blocks. There's a signaling in the block template, and it's essentially the vote, right? And we're usually looking for a certain level, like a certain number of blocks, a certain percentage of blocks over a certain period of time. If we hit 80% of the blocks or 90% of the blocks over a certain period of time have happened, then we will consider the soft fork to have been activated. Well, if there's only 6 places that will make that decision, that's a pretty small group. And by the way, roughly half of the world's hash rate is coming out of these Bitmain affiliated ones. So it's essentially saying that, like, if it's a simple democracy, Bitmain almost has it. I'm not even talking 51% attack. I'm just talking about, the future. And let's just say Bitmain hasn't always sided with the community in terms of what it wants. Whether that was the block size itself or SegWit 2x or like these sort of things, they've definitely been on the other side of the community. So it's very, very important that the template creation go from these, we'll call it 15 points, to hundreds, if not thousands of points. So that if censorship were to be thrust upon the community, like OFAC compliance as an example, that there still be a large enough group that a non-OFAC compliant transaction would still likely get selected by somebody. And I think a lot of people who don't study this, let's say the level that I have, and I understand why, because this is my business and it's not most people's business, but I think there's this perception that, oh, well, they'll just change pools. Like if the threat comes up, oh, well, the big miners will just flip. But again, I don't want to attack specific companies, but let's just say I'm a big public miner, okay? And I'm mining with Foundry right now, which, by the way, Foundry, I like Foundry. I think they run a really good pool, and I believe their intentions, at least to date, have always been very good. So I'm not being critical of them. But they're in a position as the largest mining pool in the world with 30% of the world's hash rate of being a highly likely target. Let's say if the election moved a certain way, maybe they could come under a lot of pressure. Maybe let's say for OFAC compliance. Let's imagine a world where Elizabeth Warren is the Treasury Secretary, as an example. Now, if we were in that situation and I've got my hash rate pointed to Foundry, and then the government comes in and says, Foundry, must comply. Now, am I going to switch from Foundry? Okay, well, I got one choice, which is and they're going to go after Foundry and Luxor, let's say, which is the second biggest US pool. So if I want to go with a big pool that has the financial standing that I can be comfortable with, it leaves me only with Bitmain related pools as a choice. Well, that's probably not any better to move from this US pool. If I stick with Foundry, do I actually have any financial damage? Probably not. Probably really doesn't affect my mining output in a great degree. I currently have all of my reporting, all my financial reporting, all my auditing, all of my stuff geared toward Foundry. So I have to rebuild all of that. On a technical basis, I could, in a matter of a handful of minutes, probably switch from Foundry to another pool. But we talked about some of this stuff earlier. If you're a public company, you want your auditors, your financial reporting, your legal department, which says, well, we got to have a SOC 2 compliant pool. So what I'm getting at is you can't flip. If I'm that big public company, I can't flip. And I really don't have a lot of motivation to flip other than shareholder pressure. That would be the only thing that would motivate me to switch, I think, would be if my shareholders said, hey, I'm going to start selling the shit out of my stock I own in you if you go down this path. But to be honest, that company probably would prefer it to stick with it, because now they don't have to worry about this. They don't have to worry about violating OFAC. They don't have to worry about a lawsuit. It's actually easier for them to stay with it than it is. Now, that's why we need small, independent, privately held miners with hash rate all over the world, because I think we should assume, again, it's probably not an if question. I think it's a when question. When these things come in and they put their pressure in, that the Bitcoin that we think of, which is borderless, censorship resistant, all those sort of things, it needs 20-30% of the hash rate mathematically for us to preserve that the Bitcoin that we know of. So it's not an existential risk to Bitcoin, but it is an existential risk to Bitcoin with all the attributes that we like.
Yeah, I could see that. It's things like that, though, that, I hate to kind of, I always wonder, like, do people worry about that when they start thinking about, because a lot of people hear R for price, and they hear existential risk to Bitcoin and things like that. I wonder how it impacts sort of that part of their thinking. It's interesting. There's a few things we're going to, I want to wrap up with a few personal questions based on some tweets you put out, but we're going to skip through the threat of ASIC centralization. And I kind of want to cue these up because there's a lot you bring to the table, and we're going to talk again. So maybe the consequences of free energy, probably the hell that miners are going through right now. Public companies, I really stress for people to think about public mining companies, really what they're doing here if they're investing in the shares of public mining companies, and how that may or may not line up with the ethos of Bitcoin. And maybe to think about these companies as more commodity producing entities, and what maybe the impact of their value is, and when they're maybe have negative cash flows, and maybe how they're financing their business in this economy or the this landscape, and what that means for the long-term health and the value of your bet. The impact of AI, we didn't really get into. but you put out a few tweets that I think might really resonate with people. These are a bit personal, so feel free to skip some of these questions if you don't want to. But
Okay.
I think even this conversation about Bitcoin is a little maybe heavier, and we haven't even gotten into like politics and the economy and everything. Things are crazy right now. So maybe for anyone who's struggling, getting through 2024, maybe even contemplating suicide, do you have any maybe words of advice for people?
Wow. Okay. Well, I'll share with you because I have shared it. I lost a brother to suicide. And
Sorry.
it's, it's something that never leaves you. I'll say that, so the people out there that are struggling, I would say first, there's a whole bunch of people that feel for you, that care about you. And you probably do not understand the impact that you have on people's lives. And I can say for my brother that a day doesn't go by that I think about him, but also a day doesn't go by that I don't deal with guilt over what happened, because and I'm not asking anybody to feel sorry for me. But what I deal with is what what could I have done differently? This was my younger brother, by the way. So, I as a big brother say, I know certain things happened in his life, and I look back and say, I probably wasn't there for him in the way I should have been, or I could have done this, or I could have done that. And, we're all fallible as human beings, but, the guilt that you leave behind is huge. And so, I appreciate for anybody going through it that there's a pain and there's a darkness. But I promise you, there's people that love you and that care about you, and that when you leave are going to hurt terribly. And their pain's never going to go away. You're shifting some of this pain to some other people. And I'll say, to anybody out there that way, I'll talk to anybody. If you don't know me, you can DM me, and I will talk to you. I'll do a private Zoom with you. I'll do a phone call with you, and I'll do my best to help you from my experience. And if, I'm not a professional, but, if you just need somebody to talk to, um, I'm here, because I think that's what a lot of people need. Um, but, please seek help for it. Please don't look at it as the answer. Please think about the pain that you'll leave behind. And don't don't think anybody's going to think worse of you for reaching out to help. That we're all human. We all have dark days. I appreciate that some of you may have darker days than others, but man, we need you, and we want you, and we love you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you said there, and definitely reach out. I'd be available too. I'm available. I bring it up. I know it's a tough subject to talk, and I appreciate you speaking so honestly and eloquently about it. Because we talk a lot about fix the money, fix the world, but the money is broken and it's really shitty, and it's getting shittier, especially this year. I think a lot about like 2008, what we saw in the financial crisis. I mean, and with like things like Madoff, and there were people who committed suicide there. And you think about just all the sort of banking crisis, but a lot of times people think, oh, they made bad decisions and they screwed up. But I think they don't think about the small business owner who borrowed money because they thought tires were pumping this year and they could get money at 6%, and then they had to refinance at 8 or 9 or 10. I work in fiat land a lot, and I just finished up a gig standing up an accounting department for a private equity backed entity that's trying to go from 200 million to a billion in sales. And,
Mhm.
they just fired the CFO, and assistant controller walked, and people are skipping weddings to get their work done, but their boss is gone, so all that credit you built is gone, and people's lives are at stake. And the price of commodities are going up, and if you're in a commodity producing business or you need those inputs, and You got revolver loans for hundreds of millions at X at 11%. I mean, like you can get into a bad situation unexpectedly or without maliciousness or being nefarious. And so for anyone going through tough times, I mean that's kind of I brought it up and appreciate you getting into that. And then maybe to switch gears a little bit. So you mentioned one of your greatest personal thrills, which was finding first block at Ocean.
Yeah.
And maybe you could talk a little bit about that and what that meant to you.
Well, I think we all wonder about, we talked about it to a certain degree already, like leaving a mark, making a contribution, and some of it is, like we were in Nashville, so, and I'm sure this happens to you as well, doing what you do, but somebody maybe come up to me and shake my hand and introduce themselves and say, hey, you said this, or you gave me this insight, and I appreciate it. Like that means a whole lot to me. But what's special about the thing that you mentioned is that, in the history of Bitcoin, there have been just over 850,000 blocks that have been mined. And especially those blocks mined over the last 8 or 9 years, they've all been mined through these pools. And the pools have not identified the miner that mined the block. So you would see the information reported from the network would say Brains mined it, or Foundry mined it, or whatever, right? And that's great. And if you're part of that pool, you can get a little sense of satisfaction. But what Ocean did was Ocean changed it so that not only do we know Ocean won the block, but we know the exact machine that did the work that found the block. And we've been blessed several times. I've made public announcements on a handful of them, but we've been blessed several times within the Barefoot family of companies to have found the blocks, but we found the very first Ocean block. So it was the first block really that we could identify, that the network could identify for almost a decade, that said that machine right there mined this block, and it happened to be the first one, mined for Ocean. And that just gave me a thrill. It's the word I used, I guess, in the tweet, because like I felt that for all eternity, at least as far as Bitcoin runs, right? I should say eternity, but for a long, long time, like that's what we did. Like I view it as a real historical mark, and it's immutable, and it can't be taken away. And me and my team and the investors and like all these people, we've all put a lot into building that, and now we can say, like, hey, we really made this contribution, and it's something that the entire network benefits from. So like I said, it's a little hard to put into words. Hopefully I've done at least a little justice to it, but we just found another one within the last week, and still just super exciting. In fact, every time Ocean mines a block, I go check and see, oh, was it one of ours? And it's so thrilling. By the way, the last one, I'll tell you something interesting. The last one, it turned out, wasn't me, wasn't one of ours, but there's another mining company, and it's called Wilson Mining. And they're a smaller mining company based in Northwest Iowa, not too far from where our main headquarters are. And they've publicly disclosed this, so I think it's fine for me to say it. They have a customer, so they do a hosting operation. They have a customer. The customer has 2 machines. He just has 2 machines. And he pointed them to Ocean, and one of his 2 machines found a block. So, there's a guy made a very small investment in mining, and running in this little place in rural Iowa, And the Wilson Mining guys are a good group of guys, and they're very true to the ethos of Bitcoin. So it's thrilling for me to see that happen too. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I love what you guys are doing over at Ocean. I mean, just full disclosure, I'm a small time investor there, but it really seems to match the ethos of Bitcoin, especially around the transparency of what's happening. I think a lot about accounting and auditing and just being able to see the transaction, what machine it is, the exact layout or specs of the subsidy and the transaction fees, what's going into the next block. One thing I find funny, I love that they give a sticker and you can put a sticker on your machine. So I just imagine one of these mining farms, you got 180, machines whirring away in one of these little facilities. And you put a sticker on, but then I also wonder, is this now the most unluckiest machine out there? Like, should I just throw this miner out? Because what are the odds that you're going to get two stickers on this one machine? Can it ever win again? Should you almost like throw it out or sell it or just, and I joke, but it's like, I just wonder what are the odds? But what have you seen maybe, maybe pointing hash rate at different pools? From the small sample size that we've experienced so far, do you think miners can make more money at Ocean, per hash rate?
Well, we have. I mean, we've one of the things we did, not just because I'm with Ocean, but just because I'm with Ocean doesn't mean we should point all our hash rate at Ocean. And so I think I have a responsibility running a mining company. Part of the service I'm providing for the people who've invested with me is like, hey, I'm going to do my best to create the greatest economic return for this, without harming Bitcoin. I think all my investors know where I stand there. Well, what we started doing was, from the moment we saw Ocean come up, was we took 10 systems, identical systems, in the same container, pointed them to Ocean. We pointed 10 more identical to a different pool, and then 10 more identical to another pool, and 10 more to another pool, to try to get a representative sample. And so we've just been running stats. I mean, there's all kinds of fancy algorithms you can put in, and what's the luck of the pool and what's the blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, like, what pool is producing the most money? Well, it's very clear cut that over the 9+ months that we've been in, that Ocean has had a greater economic return than the other three. And we continue to monitor it. Like, it doesn't, past performance is not indicative of future performance necessarily. But to date, I can say unequivocally, we've made more money by having that hash rate pointed at Ocean. We continue to do that. Now, because Ocean's a relatively small pool, it's starting to pick up a little momentum. The hash rate's climbing a little bit. The payout has more volatility than essentially any of the other pools, which use a method called FPPS, and we do that rabbit hole a different day. But the net is, look at the 9 months, and we made more money with Ocean.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I love.
For those listening, Cedric is swallowed wrong and in very, very large amount of pain. I'll give a play-by-play here of Cedric having a struggle here. So yeah, Cedric stepped away for those listening on audio. So I'll fill a little time here in case he needs a minute. And I will say, there's a fallacy about Ocean, that because Ocean's been accused of censorship, it's been accused of not having the greatest interests of
Okay.
its
Sorry about
money.
that.
That's okay. I'm just filling some time here for Rick, so I'll finish a thought here, which I'm just saying that, so Ocean, it may surprise people to hear what I've said. And I think what's surprising is Ocean took heat because when it does its template selection, the main template, although there are 4 templates that people can pick from if you're a miner, you can pick whatever one you want. But the main template used by most people filters out most inscriptions and a lot of those sort of things. And so there's a perception that it must therefore pay less money. And uh, there's a lot more to determining the economics of a pool than just what transactions went into the template. Go down that rabbit hole another day. Cedric looks like he's returning to the living. He was in a lot of pain there. I could see struggling for air.
That was
So
fun.
all right.
Well, I got one more question.
All right.
So I love that you got really close to predicting the last halving date.
Mm.
I love that you run numbers like this and figure this stuff out. So my final question is, are you ever going to retire and I don't know, just go and pursue rest, relaxation, recreation, and pleasure? Is that in the cards for you? What do you think about retirement?
Yeah. Well, I don't believe in it. I don't believe
Not that
it's
your retirement age. That's not even what I'm asking, but just in general.
well, the truth is I'm 60. A lot of people retire at my age.
You've retired before.
And I did. I retired at I did well at Gateway. I had a great run and thought when I was 35 that I should retire because I thought that's what you did, right? You acquired a certain amount of money and then you kind of look at it and go, what lifestyle do I want to have and can I ride it out? And I thought I was there, by the way. So I said, okay, well, I should retire then. Well, I found out quickly that that's not correct. That that a lot of I'll try to do this succinctly because I know it's late and we've been going on a long time. But I'll say this, what I learned was that one, happiness doesn't come from money. It comes from I think the quality of your relationships and the fulfillment that you get from contributing to your family and to society. And that if you retire and you think you're going to golf or fish all day or drink pina coladas on the beach or, whatever, I think you'll find after a brief period, you probably dig it for a certain period.
Right.
You'll find like there really isn't happiness in this. And I think that I honestly think we are programmed to work. Now, work doesn't necessarily mean you have to grind. Work can mean write a book, work can mean volunteer, work can mean, but you got to be involved in something other than just your leisure. I think as you get older, you could certainly have more of that. But like if you're not on a regular basis out doing that stuff, this is my theory for what it's worth. Take it or leave it. My theory is that we are programmed to serve others and provide value to the world, and that it's in our DNA, and that our DNA will at some point say, if we are not doing that, I'm taking you out because you are a drain on your community and your family and the services. So you're going to have a heart attack, you're going to get cancer, something is going to take you out. And I believe if you look at women, a story for another day. I still maintain my license as a life insurance agent, and so I'm familiar with actuary tables and all those sort of things. And women clearly live significantly longer than men. And like an Asian woman, for instance, is the pinnacle of the actuary tables. The standard Asian woman lives like in eternity. Well, why is this? Well, I think the difference between women and men in generalities is that as they get older in life, men have a tendency to get somewhat insular. They will sit on the rocking chair. They'll become very sedentary. I'm not saying they're not involved in their families, but compared to the women, like the women, my wife and I are grandparents. The way my wife perceives her role as a grandmother is very hands-on, let's just say. And so I think what it does is I think women live longer, not from a biological reason, but because they maintain their sense of purpose, which is often very family oriented. I'm not stereotyping, but I think they do that. And so I don't believe in retiring. I believe in finding financial independence and then just working on those things that really give you satisfaction and contribute the greatest. So I don't think we should ever retire, and we should just seek that place where we have the ability to do what we think services greatest and gives us the greatest fulfillment. And if you want to go golfing a little more often or fishing or whatever makes it, go for it. Wonderful. But don't give it up completely.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, I would think it put it in terms of like, you just want to be in control of your time and how you use it, and be able to not do the things you don't want to do. So like, there's a lot of things. I think people think vocationally, you're stuck doing things you don't want to do. You have a boss, you're not in control of your time.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed this conversation immensely, Bob, as always. I'll leave it to you for any parting words, but most importantly, let people know where they can find you and Barefoot Mining.
Well, thank you. Well, on that point, yeah, find me at barefootmining.com. I'm Boober_BTC on Twitter. But I'll leave you with this. We talk today about a lot of things that might be scary. Bitcoin changing, nation states mining, wars over hash rate, like all that. I want to make sure that we haven't left you in a dark place, because I am extremely optimistic about Bitcoin. I'm extremely optimistic about what it will do for the world. Even like, I appreciate you asking me the suicide question. Like, I believe there's a whole bunch of people that will be with us that wouldn't otherwise be with us because of what we're doing, and the quality of life of a whole bunch of people around the world is going to improve, that a lot of society's greatest problems are going to be fixed. And Bitcoin might not go exactly the way we want it to go or think it should go, but it's going to win, and it's going to have a huge positive impact on the world.
Yeah. This has been so dope, Bob. And thank you for filling in while I was having that cough fit.
You're welcome. Thanks, man.